If somebody asks you to have a drink, they certainly don't expect you to ask for a glass of water. In the world we live in, you don't have a drink because you're thirsty. You have a drink as a sign of good fellowship, to show we're all pals together. We drink to make the party swing, to loosen all those straight social laces. We drink to mark the milestones of life, birthdays, anniversaries, Christmases, New Year's. We drink to find the courage to kiss or to be kissed. But for most of the time, drinking is a social habit, perhaps the most revealing one we have. The small scotch before dinner or the 5 pints after tea, what we drink and when and where and how much of it is very much part of what we are. For some, drinking is the purest pleasure in life, an art, almost a religion. For others who find a drink equally indispensable, it's a form of living death, from which they'll only be released by death itself. Cheers. This is drinking at its most discriminating, its most expert. A tasting prior to auction of a fine selection of wines of the most remarkable range of vintages, the great Cordier sale at Christie's in St. James. The oldest wine was bottled in 1825, but each bottle commands its own degree of respect for exactly what it is.
Right, there's an 1887 available for anybody who's interested. 1887 was rather a light year. I say it was a mildew year. They had mildew on the vines, and it does have an effect on the flavor and the bouquet. But when it's been kept well, it should be in excellent condition. The color, incidentally, for those people who are interested, is very good for the age. Getting rather autumnal. It's lost quite a bit of color, but it looks very healthy. There's a nice ruddy glow. And the nose, in fact, is old, but still very fragrant and very attractive. And there is an ivy leaf smell. I say there's an ivy leaf smell. I think you'll look for it and probably detect it when you test it.
And this is drinking at its most urgent. At this level, drink demands everything you've got. You drink because you've forgotten who you are, and because you can't bear to remember. These men drink a British wine called El Dorado, mixed with hair lacquer. But between those two extremes are the millions of us more ordinary drinkers. We are the real blood and muscle of the enormous drinks industry. And that's an industry which never fails to show a profit, however hard the times. At the moment, it's lightening our pockets to the tune of £5,000 million a year. It's an odd business, really. In some parts of the country, police will tell you that it just about doubles the amount of violent crime, that drink's involved in 60% of all the murders and 40% of all the victims had been drinking at the time of the crunch. Any social worker will tell you about the part that drink plays in the battering of babies and the conceiving of illegitimate children. And yet, without drink, there'd be a lot fewer laughs, a lot less good fellowship, and the welfare state would just about fall flat on its face. For the duty on drink just about pays for the National Health Service in its entirety. This is the plant director at one of Bass Charrington's breweries, one of those automated plants that the real beer buffs call a mega keg, signing the beer duty check for a single month's production. Not for the whole firm, mind, just for one brewery. Never say the beer drinker does nothing for society.
The beer duty check, £2,193,000. That's for the month of December.
This is the brewery he directs, the new shape of the brewing business. Brewing ale has come a long way from the homely little establishment that used to smell so familiar at the end of the high street. Dad smelt like the brewery, and the brewery smelt like Dad. Not anymore. Want a pint? They'll fix you 1,000,000 pints in this place before lunch. The brewers are giants now. How they grew so great, and how any small brewers managed to stay alive, is a story that started 300 years ago. At that time, the nation was quite literally going rotten in gin. Anybody could make it out of anything. The craving for it caused squalor and disease. Mothers were debauched for it. Children starved because of it. In parts of London, every fourth habitation was a gin shop. When the brewers flooded the streets with sweet, dark London porter, they were hailed as saviours. In a few years, their businesses swelled to enormous size. In the country, brewing was still a farmhouse trade, but in London it was an industry. The brewers grew rich, famous, and respectable. The biggest of them had their portraits painted by fashionable artists. They rose above the common trade of the alehouse, became sheriffs, lord mayors of the city, politicians, bankers, country gentlemen. The wealthiest of them, the oldest established, became known as the Beerage. The breweries grew larger and larger, the brewers richer and richer. They had power, for already beer was a big source of government revenue. Some blessed the brewers for their public works, others feared them for their political influence. It was a beautiful business. The brewers made the product and owned the houses where it was sold. By merging with other brewers in the locality, they created monopolies with captive customers. There was no need to be ruthlessly efficient. They could leave pub rents low and treat tenants like trusted family retainers. They never even had to count the value of the property. There was plenty of profit in the beer. Boom or slump, war or peace, they were all good times for the sellers of ale. And it seemed they would last forever. But in the 1950s, television arrived, and for the first time for years, the beer business went slack. People stayed at home. Sales slumped by 30%. And then a terrible thing happened. A rank outsider looked at all those desirable pieces of real estate and shook the Beerage to its foundations. He tried to buy his way in. Charles Claw bid £20 million for the empire of Watney Man. The brewers frantically tried to buy the strength to keep him out. They swallowed each other with most ungentlemanly relish. The giants, as we know them, were born. Yes, the giants really have taken over. No matter what part of the country you're drinking your beer in, the chances are 4 to 1 on that you will be drinking one of the products of the seven sisters of the drinks industry. One of them, Arthur Guinness, is a bit exceptional. It's an Irish firm and they don't own any pubs. Still, they do produce about 6% of all the beer we drink. It's a nice little family business, turning over £300 million a year. Scottish and Newcastle, too, is a bit of an exception in that, compared with the other 5 members of the Seven Sisters, they own remarkably few pubs, a mere 1,600 of them. But they brew 1,000 million pints of beer a year. It can hardly be called small beer. But the other 5 have occupied every corner of the drinking man's estate. In 1960, they rushed across the country in the great takeover race. Watney's, running the most scared, ran fastest, buying up Usher's in the west, Wilson's in the north, Phipps in the Midlands. Then they swept up most of the pubs in East Anglia by taking over both the breweries in Norwich. They changed the pace and the style of the brewing industry. They were marketing the same products from coast to coast, not only beer but wines and spirits, soft drinks. Some of the giants even dabbled in milk. Watney Man and Truman now have 7,400 pubs and a chain of off-licenses nearly 1,000 strong. Whitbread's, princes of the Beerage, were not going to be left far behind. In the 10 years from 1961 to 1971, they took over 23 major brewing firms, including some of the most famous names in the trade: Flowers, West Country Breweries, Bentleys, Strongs, Brickwoods. They too have an empire of brand names, only a few of which you would know as Whitbread's. Everything from lemonade to exotic liqueurs, including 45 brands of beer. They've around 8,000 pubs and 650 retail shops, trading under the name of Threshers. Allied went national in 3 great strides. Incoop of Romford taking over Taylor Walker, Tetley Walker and Ansell's. Big breweries in Guildford and Aylesbury came later. They have 8,000 pubs and 900 Victoria wine shops, and they claim to be the biggest drinks empire in Europe. Their turnover exceeds £880 million a year, and they've announced an investment programme totalling £164 million. They own Whiteways, Coates and Gamers ciders, VP British wines, Teacher's Whisky, Grants of St James and Harvey's of Bristol. The national estate of John Courage, who took over Simmons of Reading, George's of Bristol and John Smith's of Tadcaster. They are one-third owners of Harp Lager with Guinness and Scottish and Newcastle. Just as Watney's were eventually swallowed by Grand Metropolitan, so the 6,000 pubs and 600 retail shops of John Courage are now a division of Imperial, a group with interests which range from cigarettes and frozen fish to plastic pipes and potato crisps. Bass, Mitchell and Butlers and Charrington United Breweries were already giants in their own right when they decided to merge rather than fight. Together they are Britain's biggest brewers. They have more pubs than anyone else in the business, around 10,000, and nearly 1,000 retail shops trading under the name Galleon. They also have an empire outside the beer trade, including Matthias Rosé and Hirondelle wines and VAT 69 whisky. In the mid-60s, these new national giants decided they each needed a national image. They wanted to be recognized at a glance, wanted everyone to realize just how big they were. And you needed a national beer that everyone would know was yours. Watney's was still out in front. They decided to go red. Red pubs, red barrel on draft at the bar. Forget your dull, flat local ale. Buy the one you saw advertised on the telly, always bright, always sparkling, always the same. Join the red revolution and get with it. All that jazz seems a long way from Dolly Pardo's. At Dolly's they still brew their own beer. 100 years ago, 12,000 pubs were doing it. Today there might be half a dozen. Not that it's complicated. George Cooksey does it on his own, usually on a Thursday morning. Good stuff too, gentle on the stomach and gentle on the pocket, selling at 21 pence a pint. He makes 10.5 barrels a week, enough for Dolly's 2 pubs. Gets the fire going, brews up the malted barley and the mash tun. He soaks it for about an hour at 148 degrees or thereabouts. He strains off the juice, thin, sweetish stuff they call wort in the trade, boils it with hops in a copper for a couple of hours, and when it's cool he adds the yeast. 6 days from now he'll have beer. Of course you couldn't deliver it across the nation. It's still working in the barrel. It needs to be treated gently. It needs to settle and to be drunk within a week. One thing you can be sure of, this week's brew will be different from last week's, and tomorrow it'll taste differently from today. The giants work on rather different lines. Never mind your romantic notions about the Yorkshire Dales or the Cotswolds. The first thing you want's a motorway. Even the best beer's nearly all water, and if you plan to haul 500 million pints of water around the nation at a profit, it's no use being stuck for transport. Runcorn's ideal. On the motorway, on the railway, on the ship canal. A greenfield site with a development grant, houses for the workers, and close to all those big beer drinkers of the Northwest and the Midlands. The men in white coats here can change the brand of beer simply by putting a different card into the computer. One card for Brew 10, one for Toby, one for Worthington E, one for Carling Black Label. Hauling, storing, mashing, spinning out the waste, boiling, cooling, pumping, filtering, 15 brews a day, 21,000 gallons to the brew, and none of these men ever see a grain of barley or a drop of beer.
Well, Isabel, how's the survey of the strengths of the beer?
This is where they check on what goes in and what comes out. Consistency is what they're after. As far as science makes it possible, the same brand should taste the same today, tomorrow and next week, whether it's drunk in Aberdeen or Plymouth. They spend a lot of their time working on the water. Every gallon used has to be Burtonized. First it's rendered absolutely neutral, and then the gypsum and other salts are added to give it the qualities of the real well water that they have in Burton-on-Trent. A water shortage here would be a disaster. They use 2.5 million gallons a day. The storage tank on site would keep them going for less than 2 days. It's still ordinary malted barley tipping down to the conveyors, but nobody's carrying any sacks upstairs. Unloading 15 tons takes about half an hour. These are the mash tuns. It's just that they're made of steel and they stand outside. They're too big to put a roof on. And these are the coppers, where they boil up the wort and the hops. The plant director will tell you nothing's really changed at all.
Well, the brewing process hasn't changed at all. The malting, the mashing, the boiling, the fermenting are unchanged. What is different is that we have built a brewery which has every modern gadget, every bit of equipment which will enable us to precisely control rather than to have to use the manual touch.
This little tub costs £360,000 and will increase the output by a third.
And what's your production through these 5 vessels then? Which is, after all, the entire production of the brewery, isn't it?
Yes. We produce about 60,000 barrels a week here at peak, and that's 17 million plus pints in a week.
You do get the feeling that anything could be happening in those tanks, and no one but the boffins need ever know.
One of the greatest complexities to the casual visitor is that the vessels are so big here that we cannot really see what is going on inside them. If you go around a small brewery, you can lean in, look into the mash tun, look at the fermentations and the yeast heads, and really get to grips with what is happening in the brewing process. Here you can't see it, but it is going on, just as I've explained, in exactly the same way.
Are there any dark secrets of the kind I was talking about? Things like wheat flour and rice flour and stuff like that that go in a place like this?
No, there aren't. We produce our beer using malt. We use natural hops. We use very good water, to which we add gypsum. We need a much softer water for lager than ales. And we have the usual types of yeasts for brewing the Carling lager and the Worthingtoney that we use in our other breweries.
It costs Bass Charrington in the order of £30 million to build this brewery, and all their competitors are saying now they built it at the right time and they got it cheap.
I've been told that it's the largest warehouse in the country. At this end of that building we have 9 packaging lines, 3 for bottling, 3 for canning and 3 for kegging. And those lines run at right angles away from the tanks the beer's stored in, up to the edge where the colour of the roofing material changes. And the entire dark roofed area, which is some 12 acres, is entirely warehouse where all our bottles and cans and kegs are stored on pallets.
Some traditional brewers describe all the beer brewed by these methods as bottled beer, whatever the size or the shape of the container that the brewery chooses to pack it in. All the beer is chilled to below 0 centigrade and held in conditioning tanks until all the fermentation is quite stopped. Before going to the tanks which feed the canning, bottling and kegging lines, it's pasteurized and filtered. Faced with capital equipment and production capacity of this order, was it any wonder that throughout the 60s over 150 brewing companies fell over themselves to sell for cash and a seat on somebody else's board? Who would be buying the meagre quantities they could produce? Who would want the dull-looking stuff anyway, once all this bright beer was flooding onto the market by the million barrels?
Well, Malcolm, how those new season hops?
Those came out very well, actually.
Righto, then we better taste this Worthington now, fellas.
Thank you.
But chilling, filtering, pasteurising are words seldom heard inside the brewery. Bright is the word. It's all bright beer. But it's not all the same. The plant director was emphatic. Each brand is made to its own recipe. You get the quality you pay for. They take a lot of trouble, he said, to make sure that every brand has its own character. Consistent, yes, but a national standardised brew, no danger at all. We care too much, they say, about what it tastes like. And for the top brass at Runcorn, every day ends with a booze-up.
Good. Well, have we all reached the position where we can comment? Let's work round the circle, shall we? I consider that Worthington to be on standard but slightly high in hop. Well, how about you?
Yes, I would agree with that, Arthur. I thought it had a good full palate, and the palate was pleasantly hoppy and a hoppy aroma. I thought the hops were a feature of that beer.
Yes, I got a malty flavour off that as well. Very full again.
It's definitely a clean hop. I think it was rather over our usual standard.
Here?
They can smack their lips till the beer goes sour, but keg beer really is different. Some drinkers say it's a damn good job too. You can kick it round the cellar, you can force it to the bar dispenser with high-pressure carbon dioxide. It's difficult to see what the difference is because it all happens in the barrel. But this instructor at the Brewers Society School for Publicans makes the whole thing clear. Or cloudy, according to your fancy.
Whenever we connect to a keg, we must ensure that we have got a primary reducing valve attached to this unit, to the bottle itself. Otherwise, the pressure would be too great for this cask, and of course, naturally, a potential bomb, it would explode. Now, the unit is a fitting, this fitting here. Now then, when we fit this one here, what we should always make sure that we never force the unit. Turn around gradually till it drops down into position there, then a half a turn, press the lever down firmly. Make the connection. The next thing we do is we then turn on the gas, the CO2 at the valve, thus pressurising the cask, and by connecting this, we will get service immediately the right way through this cask. Now then, there we are with service with that traditional beer, with this keg beer, which is totally different to traditional beer. With a traditional beer, of course, naturally, we would have to turn around and say, now then, if we moved a cask, we would disturb it. Here, we see with this keg beer, you see how bright, the clarity and everything there, because it is a non-sediment beer. If that had been a traditional beer, and we moved the cask, I'm afraid the results would have been far different. We would have disturbed it. It would have been very hazy, very cloudy indeed. Because here, I would like to show you a cask of traditional beer. If you notice here, on the top, the hops is floating around. Down on the bottom of the cask, you'll see the sediment which is settled. Of course, if you remember, we talked about this when we took...
This is the way all draft beer used to look, before the revolution. This is a beer festival, organised by people who actually prefer that murky-looking stuff with a fungus in it, who feel that most of modern brewing technology has been for the worst. They're members of the Campaign for Real Ale. Most of their relatives say it's just an excuse for drinking every night of the week. They say they're on a crusade. They spend a great deal of their own time and money in an attempt to save the small brewery and cask-conditioned beer. They certainly drink their share. And they want to see it served either directly from the barrel at the bar or through hand pumps, not forced up from the cellar by those potential carbon dioxide bombs fixed to the top of the barrel.
over the last 10 or 15 years, one's seen this process of the big brewers getting bigger by swallowing up little local breweries, putting them out of business or buying them up, and gradually establishing near monopolies in certain areas. So once they're in that situation, they can get a mass market beer, reduce it in strength, but continue to publicize it. And of course, many people come along and buy it because it tells them they're going to be successful with the birds, or they'll be able to get hair on their chest, whatever stories, whatever.
Do you feel that your efforts have saved anything that mattered?
Very strongly. I think we really have succeeded in doing that. We believe that we're representative of a very large number of people. People don't feel so strongly about it as we do, but people who are aware of the fact that something has happened to their beer over the last 10 years. That's not the drop they had then when they were a boy or when they were youngsters or whatever, but something has changed about it. They can't put into words possibly, but they're aware it's lost flavour, lost strength. And we're acting on behalf of all those people, because we believe that we can take beer back to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, before it became the mass market product it is now, and where there are lots of local breweries.
Since we've been in business, there haven't been so many takeovers. Now we've at least stopped the takeovers happening. We haven't reversed the process that much, but if we hadn't been for the existence of camera, all these small breweries wouldn't be going on now. They gradually get taken over by the big ones. So in a sense, we've held the line. We've stopped the encroachment of the keg beer, the fizzy beer, any further.
CAMRA began with 4 ordinary beer drinkers, and Mike Hardman was one of them. But weren't the big brewers only trying for an attractive national brew?
Yes, indeed. The brewers had been concerned for a long time, and rightly so, about the declining quality of traditional draft beer. It's a sort of beer which takes a lot of looking after. It needs a skillful landlord and it needs careful attention in the cellar. Nobody denies that it's very hard work. But I think the brewers in the 50s and 60s came up with the wrong answer altogether on what to do about this beer. Instead of training the landlord, instead of introducing schemes whereby the beer would be better looked after, they went overboard and said, we'll standardise our beer and we'll make it foolproof so that any old idiot with a spanner can look after it in a cellar. And this is the sort of beer they brought in. It was convenient to the brewers. No better in taste whatsoever than the other beer. In fact, it was much worse as far as I'm concerned. And it was easy to serve. It was always going to be the same wherever it was served. So it in John O'Groats or Cape Town, it was going to taste exactly the same. And that's the sort of beer they brought in. We didn't like it.
How could a small group like you, ordinary beer drinkers, hope to make a big dent in the huge structure of the big brewing industry?
I don't know. We didn't know at the time, and I still don't know now. It's a bit of a mystery how we ever did it. It does appear that at the same time that we 4 were standing in bars bemoaning the loss of quality and the loss of choice of traditional beers, that there were many other groups of people around the country and standing in bars and talking about it and doing nothing. And as they got to know about this little organisation that had been set up by 4 semi-drunken northerners, they started joining us. Friends told friends that there was an organisation that was trying to do something, and we didn't do a great deal to start with. We didn't have the numbers, we didn't have the influence, we didn't have the money. But people started joining us and it snowballed. A year after we formed, we had 24 members. The following year we had 1,400. We began to get going big then. Then we got 10,000 by the following year. And then come the next year, 30,000. People were latching onto us. All these little campaigns that restricted themselves to public bars suddenly became part of a nationwide campaign. And that's how we got going, that's how we got the influence, I think.
And of course you played quite rough, didn't you? One of the brewers that took some of your most savage blows in those early days was Watney's, wasn't it? And you know, you have this name Grotney's, which is a fairly effective one, I suppose. Their directors, or one of them I believe, said that there was a sort of word-of-mouth campaign at one time going against them. Now, did you feel in any way guilty about that, or did you feel it was a necessary social step?
Rather than guilty, we felt delighted that he'd noticed. I think we kicked at Watney's more than anybody else because they were the people who were most easily attackable. They did so many funny things in the late 60s and early 70s that it was so easy to have a go at them. And we really did hammer them, I think. In our newspaper and in speeches we made and in press releases and so on, It must be said now that the brewery that we've got the best relations with in the whole country probably is Watney's.
How was it that such a small outfit did have really quite such a remarkable effect?
I think we had a reasonably well-oiled, if that's the phrase, well-oiled publicity machine so that we could put our case over to the maximum number of people. And obviously, if you were the chairman of a company that was being slagged all the time by a pressure group, you'd be very worried. I think that's what happened to Watney's.
It wasn't that CAMRA's ridicule just caused embarrassment. It actually made Watney's change policies. The red revolution's over. Pubs are being painted any colour but red. Individuality's applauded. After CAMRA had published a guide to the strength of various keg beers, Watney's launched a campaign to say theirs was now 10% stronger. They've started to make old-style beer again in one of their Norwich breweries. They brought in a new chairman, Alan Shepherd, from the car industry, who is trying to dismantle the big company structure and has split the company into self-governing regional divisions. Did he think that the old Watney policies were wrong?
I think a great deal was happening at that time, and if one does a great deal, it's easier to be criticised. On the other hand, maybe some of the things were taken a little fast. It's very difficult for me to say, as you say, I wasn't even in the brewing industry at that time. I think the important thing is the positive aspect of what we're doing now, and certainly many attitudes have changed. That may be circumstances or it may be different people, I don't know. But certainly now we tend to regard ourselves as being not a large company, but a series of regional brewing companies.
Do you feel that the campaign against Watney's at that time was in any way unfair, or do you think that in the long run you've probably benefited from it?
Well, life is unfair, so doubtless that campaign was unfair. Yes, some parts of it were unfair, some parts of it were justified. Have we benefited from it? We've learned from it. Not everything that was said to us, probably the majority of things that were said to us were wrong. But on the other hand, there was a good grain of truth in it. And I think one of the things that we've learned from it is the ability to listen.
When CAMRA started, the big brewers treated the little protest group with irritation and contempt. They don't now. CAMRA may represent only the tiniest fraction of the nation's beer drinkers, but they're mainly young, highly articulate people who feel they've got a cause. This is not a national, just a regional conference, but it's held with all the seaside hotel trappings and a bit of the pomposity of the Trade Union Congress.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second of this year's regional conferences. I'm delighted to say this is the best attended regional conference in the history of the campaign, which clearly I hope indicates that it is going to be a very positive, crusading and campaigning conference. The strategy is following very much the strategy of the successful meeting held here last year, which many of you will be familiar with, and that is breaking up into the discussion groups all day today, reporting back this evening, and spending tomorrow all here together in this room.
No longer do CAMRA only concern themselves with the quality of beer.
The topic of monopolies and
they discuss everything to do with the world of the brewer and the pub, from regional monopolies to the prices in the bar.
So the whole question of monopolies is right on our plate, and the Monopolies Committee has the brief of dealing with it.
We can really do no wrong in the eyes of our local press.
This group is talking about methods of getting stuff into the local papers.
Extremely lucky, and because if you haven't got that kind of contact, as I said, the only way that you can get it is to keep on sending copy, keep on sending every week, and so they look forward to something coming from you. Yeah. Whether they use it or not is up to them.
CAMRA is very well known in our area.
This group's talking about raising funds and getting new recruits. CAMRA fights closures of pubs as well as takeovers of breweries. They publish a newspaper and an annual guide to pubs serving traditional beer. They've scored substantial triumphs. Bass Charrington boast about the quantity of real ale they brew. Watners and Allied have introduced new cask-conditioned beer. Hundreds of hand pumps have been brought back to the bar. They've been called the most effective consumer pressure group in Europe.
Really after, we are going for a choice in the facilities that are given in a bar in a particular area.
There is little point in allowing the thing to disappear and then to campaign afterwards. The time to do it is now. Pub games, they're a fast disappearing thing. Yes. Let us get in there now before they do disappear completely.
At the end of the day, each group reports to the whole meeting.
It was agreed that if it was going to be possible to break up the major companies, the most likely method by which we could do so was through different levels of taxation. Higher levels of taxation to discourage the large producers, and lower levels which would encourage the smaller producers.
Group 6 was asked to answer the following question. Is this firm rapidly becoming public enemy number 1? After discussion, it was agreed unanimously that the answer is yes. The following reasons.
Some of their language is a little overblown, and some of their demands do seem heady, but it would be a rash brewer who'd dismiss them out of hand.
2. The big threat was the infiltration of Whitbread into so many other breweries, e.g. Devenish, Marston, Moreland, Breakspear, Boddington and others. It was felt that this firm had the biggest control of any brewery in the country over what we should have.
One of the other questions we'd like to put to cottagers is a straightforward question. Will cask-conditioned ale be brewed in the Plymouth, London and Bristol breweries for at least the next 10 to 15 years, and get a definite yes or no out of them, which will give us some idea of the future policy. Okay. Thank you very much.
There's no doubt that traditional brewers owe a lot to the campaigners. There was a time when it looked as if either their product would be dying on their hands or the brewery would be bought from under them. Now they're prospering beyond all their dreams, and their profit margins are far beyond the wildest hopes of the Big Six. Young's is one of only 2 independent brewers to survive in London. John Young, the company chairman.
Well, 13 years ago, we took the decision that we were going to carry on producing what we call traditional beer, that is brewed with English malted barley, English hops, yeast and water. Now, at the same time, I would remind you, the baking industry was going through a revolution, and what I would term the plastic loaf was coming into the market, a rather tasteless bread, a uniform and standard bread. Now, one of the advantages of, one of the facets of a good traditional beer is that all traditional beer should be good, but it's imperceptibly different from day to day. That is to say, it's a living beer, and as the hops work in it, the dry hops, so you get that infinitesimal change. It should be all good, but it is more interesting than, for instance, bottle beer. We produce bottle beer, and keg beer, which is wholesome beer, but it's really bottled beer in a larger container, and it's standard and uniform. And we just regard that as rather deadly dull. But when we had this wave of keg beering coming in and pushing all the real draft beers out, or I mustn't say real, perhaps traditional beers out, those draft beer drinkers had lost their choice. So we were determined, and certainly in London, where we were surrounded by the giants, and we set out on this policy deliberately years ago, long before camera were ever heard of. Now you will hear a lot of talk of chemical beer these days, and that's all a lot of rubbish. No beer is chemical beer. You might say that our beer is chemical if you regard water, H2O, as a chemical.
But when you talk of chemical beer, there are beers that have additives, sometimes quite substantial quantities of wheat flour and things of this kind. Now, how do you regard that? I mean, things which are no longer malted barley, yeast and water, but something quite different. Rice
flour. Wheat flour came on the scene again some 15 years ago when the loaf changed and the bakers, because of the standard of living was rising, less bread was sold. Also, I would like to suggest that perhaps it wasn't so palatable as the old loaf that we used to know. And there was a lot of wheat on their hands, the bakers had, and they came to the brewers and they said, you could brew beer with wheat flour and at half the cost of malted barley. And it's very true. And people have been brewing beer with wheat and rice all about the world. But we stuck to what we call our traditional materials. The materials that British beer have been brewed with all through the ages.
Young's have 25 Shire horses. In a world of motorway breweries and purpose-built beer tankers, it's not sentiment, it's a piece of shrewd business, with every traffic jam a roar of free publicity.
These horses deliver within 3 miles of the brewery to some 43 pubs, several thousand tons of beer a year. When we had the time and motion study people 10 years ago and they arrived at the brewery, they saw a pair of horses coming out. Good gracious me, they said, they'll have to go. But when they'd looked into it a bit more, they discovered, in fact, there still was a use for horse on a very local delivery.
And in Devizes, Wadworths didn't take horses back onto the payroll until the 1970s. Wadworths, like Young's, can sell every pint they can brew. In the last 10 years, as the giants have been selling unprofitable pubs by the hundred, Wadworths have bought 50. They've even built 10 new ones. In 34 of them, they serve beer straight from the wood. In another 83, they use hand pumps. If anything goes wrong with a brew in this brewery, the irate innkeeper probably gives an earful straight to the managing director, John Cairns Bartholomew. Like Young, Bartholomew does a full day's work at the brewery every day. He likes to see all the people who work for him. He likes to be recognised when he walks into any of his pubs. How did he survive the lean years when so many of his fellow brewers went out of business?
Well, first of all, the share capital was held by the family, or a large majority of the ordinary shares were held by the family. And secondly, I wouldn't be very much good working for anyone else. And so when, about 15 years ago, all the brewery world was in a ferment, or even up to 8 years ago, and breweries were being taken over, I used to just get in my bath and used to say, well, I'm jolly well not going to be taken over, and I don't care who comes along, I'm not interested. When I'm under the ground, that's up to the people who come after me. But as far as I'm concerned, I have no intention of being taken over, and that was my attitude in those days.
Now, you say that you managed to survive largely because of your personal determination not to be taken over, that you certainly didn't want it at any price. But were there not many other small brewers who must have felt the same way as you did? I mean, it is a family business after all. Who nevertheless gave up. What was the difference? Can you explain that?
Well, of course, the great thing was that you would in those days, the great carrot which was shoved in front of your nose was that another company would pay you out for your shares and leave you to run the business. Well, of course, if they'd paid you out, why the hell should they leave you to run the business when you probably ran the business in a different way to them? So I think quite a lot of the smaller brewers fell for that game, really.
Wadworth's Victorian premises would make time and motion experts wake screaming in the night. But the revival of the small brewers has shown that economies of scale aren't everything. The small men left in business know their beer, and they know the tools they've got to make it. And many of their most valuable assets are human. Men who've been with the firm for years and are too much part of it ever to want to injure it. The big breweries are industrial plants and ruled by industrial law. Here, whatever the argument, the barrels get filled. Of all the independent breweries, this one, Boddington's of Manchester, came closest to extinction. In 1969, Allied almost won control of the shares. They only wanted the pubs. They intended to close the brewery within 2 years. Since the bid was made, Boddington's sales have doubled in volume. Last year, when profits in the trade as a whole were down, Boddington's were up by 20%. They're spending £1.5 million on new plant, and they've bought 38 pubs. The success of the independent breweries runs right across the board. Greenall Whitley is the biggest of them, and they've spent £33 million in expansion over the past 5 years. Profits this year are up by 43%. At the beginning of the 1960s, before the takeover rush started, there were 247 independent brewers. Now there are 78. But there have been hardly any takeovers in the last 2 years. From Greenall Whitley's with 1,400 pubs to George Batham with 5, the line seems to be holding. But could this taste for traditional beer prove only to be a passing phase? Keith Showering, the chairman of Allied.
Then there is a shift. Of course, there is a shift in public taste back towards naturally conditioned traditional beer. There also is a no less pronounced shift, although it's not as well publicised, towards lager. And lager is a very different kettle of fish altogether.
That's a standard response to talk of the comeback of traditional beer. But it's no less true for that. The increase in Britain's thirst for continental-style lager has been astonishing. This is Whitbread's plant in Lancashire. Don't mention English ale in this place. The name of the brew is Heineken. They have another brand new brewery at Luton, brewing a stronger Belgian lager, Stella Artois. In the 10 years since lager went on draft and you could buy it by the pint, sales have increased 12 times over. Now 20% of all beer sold is lager. In North America and over most of Europe, lager beer is the only kind they know. And the Seven Sisters all see the future in the form of continental-style lager beer. Not that they're leaving it to chance. Lager's getting all the heavy advertising and all the sales promotion. Skoll, Carlsberg, Heineken, Kronenbourg, Tuborg, Carling Black Label. None of them sound very English, yet they're all made in England. Alan Bennett, the chairman of Whitbread, is quite clear about where his company's future lies.
Obviously, a key point of our strategy must be the battle for lager, which has gone up from practically naught to over 20% of the market in a very short time. And we're lucky enough to brew 2 continental lagers, which are international names. One's Heineken, I expect you've heard of, which refreshes the parts, and the other is Stella Lager, which is in the high premium category of lager, which is a Belgian lager. And we brew both those lagers in England with British materials.
Much of Bass Charrington's Runcorn output is Carling Black Label, leader of the British brands. It actually came from Canada, and the capacity at Runcorn is being increased by 1/3 to make more of it. Bass are going to make Tuborg too, spending another £2.5 million at Burton. The battle for lager is one that no major brewer dares not to fight. Courage is still without a large modern lager plant. This is the brewery that will be closed to make way for it. They left it late and it'll cost them dear, around £60 million. Oliver Steele, the company chairman.
We put off building a brand new brewery for a very long time, and we've now come to the conclusion that we've got to have a really modern plant, particularly with the facility to brew lager beer, which no doubt you're hearing from all our competitors is the in thing at the moment.
At the moment, Courage has a 1/3 share in Harp Lager, and they market Kronenbourg. The name of the brand they hope to make here one day is Hofmeister. When Camera invented a name for the standard brew with which they felt the big brewers would flood the country, they came up with Eurofizz, and they meant it as a joke.